so many people who said, oh gosh, I miss her. And not just people of my vintage, but young people as well. And a number of people, in fact, I was with some broadcasters, hardened journalists earlier, who said that at the time of the Queen's death, they'd actually gone to Buckingham Palace just to be there. And I remember during that sort of 10-day period, I went every day because I was part of the BBC team covering it all. And at first there were thousands, and there were tens of thousands of people of all generations, types, colours, every kind of person. A lot of people taking children and grandchildren. This is part of history. And I wondered why it was that there were so many people in such a lovely atmosphere. And I came to the conclusion at the end it was because of all the bad news. Watching Ukraine, for example, in the evenings. And then here was somebody, the Queen, who had died aged 96 after a long, full life, but who clearly was a good person, who had made a commitment aged 21, which she kept to the letter all her life, was consistent, caring, kind, clearly given to a life of duty. A good, almost an exemplar of goodness. And I felt they were reaching out almost to touch that goodness. And during that 10-day period, there was a lovely atmosphere. Sort of all the rancour in the world seemed to evaporate. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if this could last? And then the day after the funeral, it was back to business as usual.
Which is inevitable.
I suppose it is inevitable. But I think the one good thing about it is it's reminded people, it's a very eccentric system we have in this country. You know, a royal family, kings and queens, people being crowned. It's been going on for 1,000 years. It has evolved. But actually, when you think about the political situation, maybe you appreciate the value of a constitutional monarchy. And the idea of my book, it's called Elizabeth, An Intimate Portrait, was to try and do two things. One was to discover why this particular monarch, 70 years in the post, was this unique person. Why, for her funeral, more heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, gathered in London than ever been gathered in one place before in the history of the world. Why did they come? What was it about her personality that made her so special? In Queen Victoria's day, she was an executive monarch. Britain really was the centre of the world. Now we're the 21st most populous country, 6th or 7th largest GDP in the world. We're not number one. And yet we were treated as number one because of the Queen. And I also wanted to try and discover what she was really like, because we all knew what she looked like. But what was she actually like? You know, what was her personality like? And since I first met her, as you know, I keep a diary, because when you were a publisher, you kindly published the second edition of my political diaries. And I've always said very generous things about them. I've kept a diary since I was a boy in 1959. Well, on the 2nd of May, 1968, I met the Queen for the first time. And she met lots of people and didn't, of course, remember all the people she met. But anyone who ever met the Queen remembered it. Did you ever meet the Queen?
Once.
And you can remember all the detail?
I can and I can't. I mean, it was about a 5-minute conversation, which was in the middle of a big reception at Buckingham Palace. And I decided, well, there was 800 people there for a special closest... No, it was a book industry event. And my partner, John, was determined. I mean, you know John, he's quite a shy person. But at that event, he said, no, we are going to meet the Queen. Good. Whereas I said, well, we've been to Buckingham Palace, let's just go. He said, no, if we stand here, she will have to walk past us. And that's when you come in, because I won't have the courage to say hello to her. And that's exactly what happened.
Brilliant.
And we spent 5 minutes with me sort of trying to keep people at bay because they were trying to elbow their way in. And it was a very easy conversation because I'd heard that she was a little bit difficult with the small talk, but not a bit of it. She asked what we did, so I told her I owned a political bookshop. And she said, now, Mr. Robinson, what's going to happen with him? And this was Geoffrey Robinson, who was involved in some, I can't remember, what it was, Peter Mandelson scandal, something like that anyway. And she was wanted all the political gossip.
Well, interestingly enough, politics really interested her. Yeah. I mean, there were one of the people I report about in my book said that going to Balmoral was always a bit of a challenge because the Duke of Edinburgh could talk about anything, you name it. He had something to say. But the Queen, if you weren't, basically it was dogs, horses and international affairs that gripped her. But what was fascinating about it is she was always normal. Nobody else was normal with her, but she was always normal. And your conversation illustrates that. She's just she meets you, she had a conversation with you. And because I couldn't talk about dogs and horses, because I know nothing about either, whenever I met her...
He says sitting there. By the way, you can watch this. We're streaming this on Global Player, and you'll be able to see Gyles resplendent in one of his jumpers with one of the Queen's corgis on the front.
I'm wearing it in her honour.
You are. I thought it looked the spitting image of my Jack Russell dude, but I can see now it is a corgi.
And there is, if you care to Google it, there's a photograph of me and the King, with him admiring the jumper, because he's very much into British wool, as you know.
Is he?
Yes. But because I couldn't talk about dogs and horses, the conversations I had with the Queen, and of course wrote about in my diary and have now incorporated in the book, ranged across a whole vast array of subjects. I mean, give you one, you may be able to answer this. We talked once about the war, Windsor Castle, the war, and I asked her for her memories of the war, just chatting. And we began with Winston Churchill. And she said to me, you maybe could research this. She said, I've always thought that Winston Churchill was probably the only person who was not a member of the royal family who's ever stood in the middle of the balcony at Buckingham Palace.
Yes, he is.
That is the fact, is it?
And I think there was a bit of controversy about it. Was it controversy? I don't know. At the time, because some people thought, even though he was this great heroic war hero, they thought that as a politician, he shouldn't have been allowed to do it.
And it was VE Day, not that long before the next general election. So I suppose, and he had become by then a proper friend of the King, as well as an ally. And the Queen clearly admired him hugely. Her first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. And normally the Queen, at a funeral, for example, or any event, she would arrive last.
Now, sorry to interrupt, but I may be inventing this, but I don't think I am. I think there were thoughts that Neville Chamberlain should go on the balcony after the Munich Agreement, which, we have a very different memory of that agreement, or interpretation of that agreement now, but at the time, he was so incredibly popular. And I think I've read somewhere that the King suggested that they should do that, and he said no, it wouldn't be appropriate. I hope I haven't just made all that up.
Well,
I can't have done.
It's a footnote for the second edition of my book. How intriguing. Well, well done, Neville Chamberlain, realising it would be. I think at the end of the war, that celebration, it was justified, and it clearly didn't affect the result of the election.
No.
But at Churchill's funeral, the Queen insisted on not going in last. She felt Lady Churchill should go in last. But when we were talking about the war, she said, well, probably her happiest recollection was Windsor Castle and the Christmas pantomimes they put on. She and Princess Margaret Rose put on pantomimes 4 or 5 years running, and the headmaster of a local school produced them. Not everybody liked him. And I said, what part did you play? Well, she said, my sister always played the girl, the Cinderella, and I was always the principal boy. And then she slapped her thigh. And she said also they loved the entertainers who came to entertain them. And one of them was George Formby. And she told me that she could sing all his songs still. And in a proper Lancashire accent, she began going, when I'm cleaning windows, and doing the strumming of the banjolele.
She was a great mimic, wasn't she?
She was a great mimic. As she said, she could do that one. I am the Duke of Lancaster, after all. But she also told me about being a great mimic, that one of her heroines was a woman called Florence Desmond. Have you ever heard of this lady?
No.
Famous in the 1930s and 1940s, a female impressionist who came and entertained at Windsor Castle. And the Queen became a really adept impressionist, not just individuals and regional accents, but also things. She could do a brilliant Concorde landing, descending over Windsor Castle and landing. The wheels coming down, all the noises. Amazing. And the actor Ian Ogilvy told me how he had one day asked her about Burmese, her famous horse. Remember that she used to ride on for Trooping the Colour. And he said, whatever happened to Burmese? And the Queen said, well, as it happens, I've just seen Burmese. She's retired into a field at Windsor, and I go and often give her sugar and carrots. And I was there today, and then this huge stallion somehow got into the field and began chasing me. And then she did a complete impression, according to Ian, of the Queen being chased by a stallion and becoming the stallion with the nostrils flaring, the noise. I mean, he said he couldn't quite believe it. So she was never frivolous, but she was fun. And, of course, we began to see this towards the end of her life with things like that Paddington Bear sketch. I had quite an interesting conversation with her about bears because the risk is, of course, nobody's quite normal with the Queen. And you can go too far. And there was this conversation.
Go on, did you?
Yeah, oh, gosh. We were talking about Paddington Bear and her love of Paddington Bear and Michael Bond and her enthusiasm for not just Michael Bond, but James Bond. And then she said to me, I was born in 1926. And I said, well, I didn't know. And she said, well, Winnie the Pooh also came into being in 1926. She said, and the first book that was ever dedicated to me was when I was 3 or 4, were the songs of Winnie the Pooh. So I thought, this is very interesting. And I said, what about Rupert Bear? She said, I loved Rupert Bear. I used to collect the Rupert Bear annuals. Did you?
I don't think I did.
You can picture Rupert
I
Bear, can't you?
I can sing the song.
Oh.
I'll spare our listeners that.
Well, we make...
lots of nods in the gallery there.
Okay.
Please don't do it, Ian, they're all saying.
Well, so I said to the Queen, because she then said she'd introduce Prince Charles to Rupert Bear, and he also loved Rupert Bear. I said, well, Your Majesty, something that will, I hope, interest you, that people who are enthusiastic about bears think that Rupert Bear isn't actually a bear. He's got fingers on his hands and boots on his feet. People say that Rupert is actually a boy with a bear's head. The Queen then looked at me and said, I think there are some things in life that it's better not to know.
I think she's absolutely right.
The conversation came to a quick end. Yeah.
So all of these anecdotes in your book.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, I don't know how many books there have been about the Queen. There must have been hundreds over the years. When you decide to write a book like this, have you got a fear of not being able to come up with anything new that everybody else has? I know you knew her, so you have a bit of an advantage over the others.
The publishers said there have been some brilliant books that will tell you about, and everybody you know, from Jeremy Paxman through Andrew Marr, has written big solid books about the Queen and her prime ministers and all the state visits and all her achievements, the longest reign in our history. And they said, that's been done and done very well by other people. Could you give us an intimate portrait of her? And 2 days before she died, I happened by chance to be visiting the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, where they showed me some amazing things that they've got there. For example, Elizabeth I's Psalter, with a lovely prayer in the back of it, written by Elizabeth I in the most beautiful handwriting when she was only a child. And there is a painting there, that she had sent of Edward VI, who was Elizabeth I's brother, to him, of herself, of Elizabeth I. And with it she'd written a letter saying, here is my outward image. If only I could share with you my inward mind. And that made me think, if I could try and reveal to people the inward mind of the Queen, that became my task, to actually reveal what was her nature, why she was this special person. What was it in her upbringing, in her parents and grandparents, I think, including her love of dogs and horses, that made her this calm, steady person, quite reserved, but without rancour. I mean, she was such a fair person. I went once to the Royal Variety Show with her. It was an unnerving experience because at the beginning of it, I was waiting outside the Royal Box, and the Duke of Edinburgh arrived with the Queen, and he said, this is Gyles Brandreth. And then he leant towards the Queen and said, he's writing about you. And then, right close to the Queen's ear, he said, he's going to cut you into little pieces. And the Queen blanched, and I blanched too, and sort of laughed, and he was chuckling away. Thought he was very amusing. But the Queen looked quite alarmed. And it's how the Duke of Edinburgh, if he liked an act, he would, applaud. But if he didn't, oh God, looking at the programme, Elton John again. Anyway, but the Queen applauded everything evenly. And at the interval I said, you seem to be enjoying the show, Your Majesty, with the Duke of Edinburgh muttering in the background, are we? And the Queen said, oh yes, I am. I said, but you seem to enjoy everything equally, because you're applauding everything equally. And she said, well, it is on television, and their families may be watching, so I want them to feel that I'm enjoying everything. And of course I am. And fairness really mattered to her. And once I began to meet her, I thought she's not nearly as conservative as I thought she was. Some of her ideas seem quite radical, and your conversation confirms that. And I said to her private secretary, why is everything, she does everything in such a conservative way, doing the way it's always been done, when I don't think that is what she really is like. And the private secretary said to me, well, I think it's a matter of policy. I think she believes that she should go at the pace of the slowest person in the kingdom so that nobody in the country should ever feel left behind. It's It's rather touching, isn't it? It's interesting when I talk about the Queen, I get quite emotionally engaged because there was something special about her. And trying to analyse what that was has been my purpose in writing the book.
And did you literally decide to write it like 2 days before she died, or were you already working on something akin to this?
Yes, exactly. I'd already done a book about Prince Philip,
Yeah.
some of which, as it were, has to feature in this because his story is part of her story. And I wrote a book about them both 25 years ago. So I had lots of raw material, and I was beginning a book that would eventually be published. But suddenly I felt free, and I felt, and I didn't know on that Tuesday when I'd read the thing about, but I went home and wrote in my diary, I want to see if I can find her inward mind. And I saw the pictures, as we all did, of her saying goodbye to Boris Johnson, hello to Liz Truss. And I also knew, because I know people in the racing world, that she'd won that race at Goodwood, a horse on that last day. And she talked to the trainer earlier in the day. And then 2 days later, she was gone. And I thought, I'm going to do this now. And so from then until literally about 3 weeks ago, I was working 16-hour days to try and finish it. And I felt a kind of freedom in doing it. I thought, actually, this is somebody unique. You're in a privileged position. Go for it. And so I have.
I wish we didn't have to go to a break because I've got several follow-up questions to that. But we do, as you know, it's 90 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
21 minutes past 8. We're with Gyles Brandreth. If you want to phone in and ask Gyles any questions about his book or anything else, I'm sure he'd be delighted to have a chat. 0345 6060 973. Tell us about the moment that you learned that the Queen had died.
Wow. Well, it was interesting. I did cry. Isn't that strange? I mean, 96 is a good age. My mother died at 96, but it was, for all of us, I think, it was not just the death of somebody who was good, and we knew was good, but also it's the end of an era, and it's all our lives. And was it Peter Hennessy who said, actually, this is the end of the post-war era. That generation is gone. And also, I also regarded the Duke of Edinburgh, who I knew because I was the chairman of one of his charities. I did regard him as a bit of a role model. And I did his biography, and it was very difficult because he didn't like revealing anything about himself at all. And yet he'd asked me to do the original one, and then, was as unhelpful as you could possibly be.
And you wouldn't have expected anything else,
and criticised every sentence. I mean, I took him the proofs, and he said, what's this you're saying about me serving on HMS Ramillies? I said, well, you did serve on HMS Ramillies, sir. You lent me the logbooks. Thank you very much. I said, you were mentioned in... He said, I didn't serve on it. I said, you did serve on HMS Ramillies. He said, I did not serve on I said, you did, sir. He said, I did not serve on HMS Remley's, I served in HMS Remley's. You don't live on your house, do you? You live in your house. You don't know anything, do you? He could be quite difficult. I remember being at an event for the charity at Buckingham Palace, and I was speaking. He was due to speak next. And throughout my speech, he barracked me. Boring. We've heard this one before. Oh, get on with it. Get tapping his watch. Really, quite difficult. But a role model in the sense that his philosophy of life, and he was very interested in Jung, and in a sense it's relevant to the whole Harry and Meghan story that we've been thinking about today. His philosophy of life, echoed recently actually by the Queen Consort, on her 75th birthday in a speech, she said, I know that the motto of the Duke of Edinburgh was look up, look out, say less, do more, get on with the job. And why he said look up, look out was because he read Jung. And Jung, the analytical psychologist, did a study of all his patients over a lifetime and came to the conclusion that those who were inward-looking, thought about themselves, brooded on themselves, were much less happy than people who were outward-looking, interested in the world around them, in science, in nature, in art, in things beyond themselves. It made them happier. And his view was, and I know he told each of his children this, don't talk about yourself. People aren't interested. And don't talk to journalists. They'll always have another question for you. Don't talk about yourself anyway. Talk about what the other person is. And that was his view of life. And I know the world has changed. And these people, like the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, come from my parents' generation, maybe a stiff upper lip generation. But actually, some people think of the war time as the best generation, where they just got on with it. And so for the Queen, a life of duty and service wasn't actually a sacrifice. It was what she was born to. She was driven by duty, but sustained by faith, and kept happy by her passions. It's the dogs and the horses that kept her going. It was having those interests that kept her going. And to be, as it were, interested in yourself, I think they would have viewed as a bad thing. So those values of theirs, I think I hold precious. And I felt a sadness that era was ending. But you couldn't be totally sad, of course, because it had been such a long life. And the day after, when the King's first speech, I thought was so good. He sort of ticks all the boxes. And I thought he understands what a constitutional monarchy is. He's going to get on with the job. And though this is a funny way to run a country, undoubtedly, somehow it works. And I love the idea of the line of our history going back, more than 1,000 years, that the King, Prince Charles, is related by blood to King Edgar, the King of the East Angles. And there's something quite intriguing about that.
Now, you do realise you haven't answered the question that I asked you.
Where was I? What was I?
Where were you when you learned of the Queen's death? I mean, did you know before the rest of us?
Yes. Well, the only reason I knew before the rest of us is on the Wednesday evening, I was at home, and my son-in-law, who was in the Coldstream Guards, phoned me and said, I'm at the Guards and Cavalry Club or something, one of these military clubs in Piccadilly. He said, and people are gathering here talking about Operation London Bridge. Clearly something has happened today. And this was the day before, 24 hours, well, it was 24 hours before she died. Clearly something is happening. So that was the sort of heads up.
So the establishment kind of knew.
Well, they knew something had happened. They were on the alert the day before. But she certainly, on the Tuesday, had been fine. And there was a clergyman who went the weekend before, who was one of the bishops. She'd have a bishop come to preach at the local church. And he had supper with her and lunch with her, and she was in fine form. But in a sense, how wonderful to go so quickly.
Yeah.
Fantastic. What a reign. I don't think we're going to see another one quite like it for quite a long time. It's interesting how these queens...
We won't see it, will we?
I don't. Don't you notice how vigorous I am? I'm taking the pills.
Very good for 85.
I'm going to be 75.
Are you really?
In March of next year. And my friend, I call her my friend, it's quite bold to call her my friend, Dame Judi Dench, I do a stage show with her, is going to be 88 tomorrow, the 9th of December. And I'm going to be 75 next year. And we've been doing these shows in the West End at the Gielgud Theatre, and they've sold out because it's Judi Dench. And so we decided that for my birthday, my 75th birthday in March, on the 5th of March, we would do a show. And Judi Dench said to me, "Where haven't you played in London?" You know, in the Guildford Theatre. I said, "Well, I haven't played that many theatres." She's played in every theatre you can imagine. And actually, once in 2 theatres simultaneously. She was appearing in Les Miserables and in a Shakespeare play on the same night. Because, yes, she managed it because there was a big gap. And she went through to take part in the whatever that scene is on the barricades. That's it.
Yeah.
And the person next to her, because she'd not actually been in it before, said, "At this point you get shot." So she sort of, "Ah!" and was falling to the floor when he whispered in her ear, "In the arm." So she quickly recovered. Anyway, so she said, "Well, where should we do this?" I said, "Well, I've never played the London Palladium." She said, "London Palladium." So on the 5th of March, Judi Dench and I are going to be at the London Palladium. And I said, "You know, I'm so lucky to know you." She said, "You know all the dames." And I thought, well, perhaps I do know quite a few of them. So we're going to have Dame Judi Dench, Dame Eileen Atkins, Dame Sheila Hancock, Dame Maureen Lipman, Dame Sian Phillips, Dame Floella Benjamin, Order of Merit.
She's Baroness now.
Baroness and Order of Merit, Dame Joanna Lumley. They will all be there at the London Palladium. It's a Sunday matinee, so we can have, drinks and cake afterwards, all in aid of the Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Fantastic.
Because I have a...
You sold all the tickets?
Well, they don't go on... I'm telling you this now. They don't go on sale until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. You're the first person I've told this to. 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, London Palladium.
It's like getting tickets for... I was holding on to get tickets for ABBA.
Well,
it's like that, isn't it?
Was it your 60th birthday?
Yes, which you came to.
You kindly took me and some friends to see the ABBA Avatar show, which was... beyond belief brilliant.
It was, wasn't it?
It was brilliant.
I don't think that you were looking forward to that very much.
To be honest, Michelle, my wife, was really excited. She'd wanted to go.
And you thought, well, you'll take one for the team.
I thought, exactly, and I thought, well, I've heard of ABBA. I've met one of them. I wasn't sure which it was, one of the 2 boys. I thought, we'll go along. It was like being with ABBA in their prime.
Yeah.
I won't give anything away because people should go. But I will tell you that Gyles and Judi and all the dames, we are there in the flesh. It really is us. If we look 88 and 75, it's because we are 88 and 75. And all these other dames, and I mentioned Floella Benjamin, actually, to revert to the Queen. This is interesting. Almost the last thing the Queen did, one of the things she signed off, I think the week before she died, was to present the Order of Merit to Floella Benjamin. And she was reading Floella Benjamin's memoir of her childhood, of coming to this country from Trinidad at the time, and of what it was like to be one of the Windrush generation, and the racism that Floella and her family came across. They loved coming to Britain, the motherland. They were so excited, and they were welcomed, but there was racism, and some of which Floella writes about very graphically in her book. And Floella met the Queen when I think Floella was the Chancellor of Exeter University and the Queen came to visit. And they had a long conversation. And Floella said she had never met anyone so empathetic. And the Queen listened. And they'd had this conversation. And the Queen very rarely expressed views about anybody. She'd met everybody in the history of the world. Literally from Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe through to Vladimir Putin and Idi Amin. She had met them all. And she never normally would mention who was her favourite. But she did volunteer that Nelson Mandela was unique. And the reason? He emerged from 27 years in prison without rancour. And I think she was deeply impressed that in Floella there was no rancour. She wrote about these experiences, but still she loved Britain. And she noticed how Britain had changed. And I was very interested that almost her last official act before meeting those 2 prime ministers was to award the Order of Merit to Floella. So she will be one of our dames, and I hope she might tell some of her stories of meeting the Queen.
And of course, Nelson Mandela always called the Queen Elizabeth, didn't? And there weren't many people that did that.
No. And I think he was able to do that because the Queen was totally normal. If you treated her normally, she was always normal. So that, for example, there was a big hoo-ha about Michelle Obama putting her arm around the Queen. And what people don't realise, and there are not many photographs of this, they saw Michelle Obama, but they didn't realise that immediately the Queen reciprocated by putting her arm around Mrs. Obama. And Mrs. Obama later revealed that actually they were doing that because they were both exhausted. And they'd been talking in a corner about a long day in high heels. The Queen actually...
Something you do quite a lot.
Well, I have done it in my time.
No, I remember. Zippity-doo-dah.
And you do get used to it. You do get used to it. But the Queen... One of the things I did notice about the Queen, she spent a lot of time standing up. And she was very sturdy until she became frail towards the end of her life. She was very sturdy. And she used to move from one foot to the other, sort of keep herself going, moving from one foot to the other. I remember that. I went to a church service with her once, and we were waiting outside to go, and she was moving to one foot to the other. And then it was time to go, and we walked in. And this is a church service that had been organised by me because it was the Duke of Edinburgh's 60th anniversary, being the chairman of this charity, the Playing Field Association. And the Queen was the patron, and he was the president. And I said to the Queen, we're going to honour His Royal Highness, the Duke, because he's been 60 years, the president. You're the patron. How do you think we should celebrate this? And I thought she'd say a party, maybe a reception at Buckingham Palace. You know, I could see us in there quaffing and sluicing. And she said, oh, we're giving thanks, are we? I said, yes. She said, I think a Thanksgiving service would be appropriate, don't you? Well, I thought, well, fine, if that's what you want, Your Majesty. So I arranged this at a
Slightly
church.
crestfallen.
Yes, exactly. That was conveniently placed halfway between Buckingham Palace and the headquarters of the charity, which were then in Knightsbridge. So this was a church in Sloane Square. I did not check it out. We just booked the church, and the vicar seemed very keen, and we turned up, not realising it was a high Anglican church, smells and bells.
Oh.
We go in, the place is suffused with incense. The Queen walks happily through the incense. The Duke of Edinburgh is behind, muttering to me, it's supposed to be a celebration, not a cremation. Where's the smoke coming from? And he's wafting the incense away. Extraordinary. So we're then back in the vestry, and the Queen is expressing interest about the church. And she says, oh, this is an arts and crafts church, I think. And I said, yes, it is. She said, oh, I think John Betjeman would have loved it. And she said, I think we must come back. And the Duke of Edinburgh said, I don't think so. But interestingly, it was on that occasion that we looked at the service, and it was the King James Bible. And it was the Book of Common Prayer. And there was printed on the page, the Lord's Prayer. And I said to her, Mum, my father used to say the Lord's Prayer every night. And she said, well, I do. She said, often I think the Lord's Prayer, that's all you need. Which is interesting. And she told me that she, like my father, I prompted it, but would say his prayers. Maybe your parents did. It was a generation ago that did that, on their knees, even as old people, at the bedside. You know.
Absolutely. I've just looked at the time, and we're way past news headlines time.
Oh, God, we should have had the news.
Yeah, but you're so gripping, Giles.
That's very good.
I'm not going to apologise for going out to the news this time. It's 8:36 news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
I apologise.
An American woman who admitted causing the death of a 19-year-old by careless driving in Northamptonshire 3 years ago has avoided a jail term. Appearing on video link from the US, Anticulus was given an 8-month term suspended for a year. She left the UK 19 days after the collision under diplomatic immunity. A top health official in England admitted local pharmacies may encounter shortages of some antibiotics to treat strep A, but authorities insist on a national level there are sufficient stocks. And Prince Harry's claimed in his new documentary that his family dismissed safety concerns about the media's relationship with Meghan. He said relatives asked why she should get special treatment, with attention from reporters seen as a rite of passage. LBC weather, wintry showers continuing for northern Scotland this evening. Clear skies elsewhere with a widespread frost and lows of -5.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:39 on LBC. Let's take a call. Giles, if you'd like to put your headphones on. You'll remember this from your days presenting on this radio station. The
I do.
importance of headphones. Victoria is in Stansted. Hello, Victoria.
Oh, good evening.
Hello.
I can't believe I've got the opportunity to speak to Gyles direct.
It's like royalty, isn't it, really?
This will be one of the highlights of my life.
Oh, Victoria.
You've led a sad life, Victoria, haven't you?
No, she hasn't. She's been named after our second longest reigning sovereign.
Exactly.
I was.
Yeah.
I was. Giles,
Yes.
do you remember opening the new recreation ground in Docking in Norfolk in about 1986?
I do remember that. I genuinely do. It was when I was the chairman of the Playing Fields Association.
Yes.
And you probably remember it. That's the bit of Norfolk where the family trees don't fork too often.
Oh, he's outrageous.
That was a joke, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, it was.
I shouldn't have said that. Now I can't run to be mayor of Norfolk.
No, exactly. Well,
But also, it's very much part of the Chelsea Triangle now.
Yes.
And house prices in Docking have rocketed.
Yeah. Anyway, what's your question, Victoria?
So Giles touched on how the Queen's death really marks the end of the post-war era, which when the commentator said that really resonated with me. And following the passing of the remarkable Johnny Johnston today, who does he look to? Who do we have left of that era who Giles would think of as part of that set of that chutzpah and that grit and that integrity?
you're right. When David Attenborough goes, it really will be the end of everything as we know it. Somebody was saying to me last night that one of the things that we lack now is a kind of aesthetic, cultural, national leadership, people of quality. There was a programme celebrating the anniversary of the BBC. The BBC is 100 years old, where we saw people like Lord Reith and even Hugh Weldon, former leaders of the BBC, and I watched these people, and they seem to have a stature about them that one doesn't feel is around today. They talked about things in a big way, and they had a sort of vision for the country. Interestingly, I think for the future, I am an admirer of the King. And I think his work for, say, something like the Prince's Trust, his values are good ones. But it is quite challenging. At the interestingly, I with Dame Joanna Lumley, since we're dropping names, Dame Joanna Lumley and I
That's a pretty big one.
hosted a party for the 75th birthday of the Queen Consort back in July, a lunch party for older people. Everybody in the room was in their 70s, 80s or 90s. That's why you weren't invited, Ian.
You got that in quick. 'Cause
Yeah.
I was thinking, thanks for the invite, Giles.
Yeah, and there were some remarkable older people there. Leslie Caron, I was so excited. I sat near her. From Gigi, do you remember? Well, you weren't before your time. Anyway, there were some amazing older people there. And Archbishop Rowan Williams proposed the toast. And I know people used to have reservations about him when he was...
Weirdy.
Well, because he had a beard and he had the long hair and he was poetic. But actually, I think he's rather become like Tony Benn when he was actually a minister. People thought, oh, God, he's as crazy. As an elder statesman, the middle classes flocked to him and they loved him. Yeah. And I rather feel that about Rowan Williams. But he gave a speech that actually was quite inspiring and moving and encouraging. And what he also said about this generation of people, and he was really addressing the Queen Consort, but he said, all of us in this room, he said, the advantage of being us is I think we don't take ourselves too seriously. And maybe the world now takes itself a little bit too seriously. Let's just relax, hang loose, decide what the important things are, and not worry about the unimportant things.
The thought of Rowan Williams hanging loose is not one that I wish to dwell on, to be honest. Victoria, thank you for that. Now, you mentioned a phrase there, the Queen Consort.
Yeah.
Now, the Times has issued an edict that all their journalists are to call her the Queen, and I'm doing the same because it's a horrible sort of construct, isn't it, Queen Consort? What's
it's
your
not
view
a
on
horrible
that?
construct for two reasons. One, it echoes the Prince Consort, Queen Victoria's husband, who was proud to be called the Prince Consort. And it was the title that Her Majesty the Queen, Elizabeth II, suggested only earlier this year in her Platinum Jubilee message that she hoped in the fullness of time that Camilla would be known as the Queen Consort. And during this interim period, it prevents people from confusing Elizabeth II, who many people still think of as the Queen, with the person who is the consort to the new king. My view is this, that she is the Queen Consort, and she's still called that in the official documents when the register is published each day. What the royals are doing, it says the King and the Queen Consort went to. That after the coronation on the 6th of May next year, when they have both been crowned, I think that is the point at which we can all then say, well, we now have King Charles and Queen Camilla. And I have to say, she's earned her spurs.
Yeah, I think so.
She delivers the goods, and she seems to have the right attitude, and seeing her in action, I think it's marvellous.
I think that is a good note to go to a break on time for once. But we will be taking more of your calls. In fact, we've got a former constituent of yours calling in.
Look,
Giles,
I'm here to apologise in person.
From the city of Chester, where there was a by-election last week, where not a good result for your former party. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And, of course, we will be mentioning this Netflix documentary about Prince Harry and the Duchess of Sussex. 8:45 is the time.
LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
Gyles Brandreth is with us talking about his new book, published today, Elizabeth, An Intimate Portrait. Now, I'm going to go to a call now, because if I don't, I suspect we'll run out of time. And it's a former constituent of yours, Nicola in Chester. Hello, Nicola.
Hello. I was a constituent, but I wasn't voting because I was only 14 when I met Giles. I was a waitress in a cafe, and he was my first ever customer.
Oh, how
in
wonderful.
the Three Kings Studios, and I always used to serve him Barra Breath. I remember that.
I do remember the Three Kings Studios. It's fantastic. Let's keep in touch so that as I'm about to go, when I pop my clogs 25 years from now, let's be in touch. And you can serve me, I can be your last customer as well, so that I can bookend your life, bookend your career.
Unfortunately, it's
Are you
not
still
there anymore.
Oh.
But I do now, 30 years later, I'm actually leading the tourism strategy in Chester.
Oh.
And I just wondered, really, obviously the Queen has been incredibly important to the tourism industry of Britain, and just to get your perspective
Well,
on how we continue that with the king and starting with the coronation.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the royal family in many ways is central to brand Britain. And I'm one of those people. I mean, I know that the king and the court are very conscious that financially the country is very hard pressed and they don't want to have an extravagant coronation. And that was true in the early 1950s of the Queen's coronation, because it was not that many years after the war. But my feeling is one of the things that they admired about the funeral of the Queen was how beautifully it was done, how moving it was at one level, seeing those young men carrying the coffin, but also the ceremonial, the pageantry. It's what we do better than anyone else in the world. And it is an extraordinary advertisement for our country and its heritage. So I hope they won't be too economical. I hope they will do it properly and to the full. But also, Chester, there is no more beautiful city in the United Kingdom than the city of Chester. And you will know.
Have you not been to Norwich?
I have been, and I still say that Chester is the most beautiful city in the United Kingdom. But the Queen chose, when Meghan joined the royal family, and the Queen was very welcoming to her, and took her on her first solo trip, the Queen and Meghan, and they chose to go to the city of Chester.
They did.
And one of the reason was that the Queen looked at the itinerary and saw that she was opening a theatre, the Story House Theatre in Chester. And the Queen thought, oh, theatre, Meghan. Because the Queen had said to Meghan when she joined the royal family, you are an actress, this is your profession. You must, if you want to, continue in that profession. That's not a problem for us at all. But Meghan said, no, I want to do this. I'm interested in the Commonwealth. I want to get on board. And so she went to Chester and was a great success. The Queen said so. The Lord Lieutenant told me, the Lord Lieutenant of Chester, that you couldn't fault Meghan that day. She was impeccable. She did it all brilliantly. The Queen then suggested to Meghan that maybe it would be an idea. She was, coming in, and it was part of today's episode about women coming into the royal family from outside, that maybe to mentor her, it would be helpful if Sophie Wessex contributed. And she said, maybe Sophie can help you. This Meghan didn't like and said, no, I don't think I need that. Thank you. I've got Harry. And I think that's where it began to, things began to go a little bit awry. But I'm with you. It's wonderful that you're here on the line. Thank you for that cup of coffee. And I'm glad you're now running tourism for Chester.
Now, Nicola...
Yeah, I was sitting just in front of the Queen and Meghan at that event in Story House. But it was the most awkward seat in the theatre because I couldn't really turn round. It was too obvious. Everyone else could get a good look of them, but I was just in front. So, but you could see the rapport between them. It was, the Queen was so gracious with Meghan and so friendly with her, and we have some great images of that visit.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, certainly the members of the royal family that I have met were so welcoming and excited and delighted that Harry, who everyone loves, and the Queen loved, she loved all her grandchildren equally, but she found Harry so amusing. Whenever Harry called, he was put through straight away on the phone. So everyone was delighted with Meghan. And I think we as a country were delighted with Meghan. And people like me, I rather liked her mother as well. I thought, this is all marvellous.
Now, Nicola, final question before we let you go, and think very carefully about your answer to this. Was Gyles a good tipper?
Oh, gosh. Well,
Clearly
considering I only earned £1.80 an hour back then, I think any tips would have been a bonus. So I have to say yes.
See, that was what it was like under John Major's government. No minimum wage, Gyles, and it was all your fault.
But look what happens to them. They begin with work experience age 14 and they end up running tourism for the same city.
Nicola, thank you very much indeed for your call. Where did it all go wrong with Meghan then? Because, I will watch this Netflix series, probably against my better judgment, because I'm sure it'll make me quite angry. But it's so sad, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. There is a huge cultural difference. One of my daughters-in-law is American. It's a different country. It's a different approach. Today, I think it was in the programme, she was talking about how when she met Catherine and William for the first time, she was ready to hug them. And she couldn't quite understand why they didn't particularly want to be. Well, a lot of English people don't expect to be hugged by somebody they've never met before. You work up to that. So it's a change, it's a different view of the world. And it's a different generational thing, this letting it all hang out, talking about how you feel and, all of that. It's just not the way we have been doing it. And I'm with Harry. He said she came into my world and gave it a go, didn't feel it as if it worked for her. Now I've gone into her world and I'm giving it a go. And fair enough. And there are lessons that we can learn from her. I mean, some of this stuff, the racism awareness stuff, is actually quite good for people of my generation and background to become aware of, and in a way that my grandchildren won't need to. So there are useful lessons for us all to learn from this. I mean, we still admire Harry hugely, and we just accept they're going on a different journey.
But do they have to do it so publicly? That's the point.
They do, because they need the money. That is the Queen who took the long view. Well, she would have remembered the 1930s when her uncle abdicated to marry, a twice divorced American. And they then had to earn their living for the rest of their lives. He published 2 books in coronation year. 2 books. And he didn't get a 3-book deal like Harry, but he got a 2-book deal. And then they appeared on chat shows, the Duke of Windsor and the Duchess of Windsor, telling their story. I think his book, never mind Harry's book being called Spare, I think the Duke of Windsor's book was called A King's Story. Oh, yes. He wanted his truth to be known. This one will run and run. Their challenge is they're young people, just turning 40. We may have 30, 40, 50 years of this.
Do you not feel, though, that it's going to end in tragedy in some way, that this is not going to end well?
I hope not. I hope not. I hope once they've got all this out of their system, they will do what they've committed themselves to doing, which is good works by their standards in their world. As the King said, I wish them well. As they start out making a new life for themselves in America, and that's what they've chosen to do. And I think we should wish them well. Just hope for the best.
You've had a great ability over the years to reinvent yourself, doing all sorts of different things. After the coronation next year, are we going to see another incarnation of Gyles Brandreth? Because kind of all the royal, to me, that signals a bit of an end.
I think it does, to be
or
honest.
Beginning.
No, I think you're right. No, I think my book about the Queen following on from writing about Prince Philip, that is the end of that era. An amazing story. You're not going to get a more extraordinary story, because it's also the story of our times. Well, who knows what beckons? The 5th of March, the London Palladium, with all the dames. Dame Judi Dench, Dame Joanna Lumley, there they all are.
You've already done that.
No, I know, but it's because...
I should tell you...
On the night before, where are you?
On the night before... I'm at the Carriage Works in Leeds.
That's what I thought. Yeah. That's what I was leading up to.
Which I'm looking forward to.
So nobody knows.
I'm big in Leeds.
What the future
Jackie
holds.
Smith's even bigger.
I loved Leeds because that's where I used to go to do Countdown in the early days.
Of course it was.
Yeah, great.
Do they not do it there now?
No, they do it in Manchester now.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, I get around. What I like about life, and I think I've learned a lot from older people. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were role models. Duke of Edinburgh in particular. He just carried on. All these older people. My friend Nicholas Parsons was still chairing Just a Minute, age 95, at the top of his game. Here is Judi Dench, as I say, 88 tomorrow. When I go onto the stage with her, you feel the wall of love coming towards you, but you also see a woman full of life because she's living life. And as long as you've got your health, and touch wood, and I did fall over recently, so I've got a physiotherapist I'm trying to improve.
Have you ever fallen off a stage?
Yes.
You have?
I have fallen
Something
off
we have
the
in
stage.
common.
We have. Rex Harrison used regularly to fall off the stage.
Yes, but that's a different reason.
No, because he was losing his eyesight, poor man. He was doing My Fair Lady, late in life, he revived it, and he'd be going, damn, oh my God, as he fell into the orchestra pit. So who knows what the future holds, but I think we should keep going. That's my message.
Yes.
Keep right on to the end of the road, because the best is yet to come. And if it isn't the best, the end hasn't come.
Well, I'm sure that this time next year, Gyles will be back with another book.
We will be.
And I should tell you, in this hour next week, do you know who I've got? An even bigger name than you next week.
Is there a bigger name?
An hour with Sir Clifford Richard.
Now, look, I must just tell you about Cliff. Very, very briefly, because I know I've gotten in 40 seconds.
Yeah.
This is true. Judi Dench and I have been doing the show in London. we saw in the queue, waiting to see our show, Cliff Richard. He had queued up and he'd bought a ticket. And at the end of the show, we invited him to come round, and he was too shy to come, but he did come. And I said to him, Dame Judy is really looking forward to meeting you, Cliff. I said, when you go, will you sing Congratulations? And he went in singing Devil Woman.
If only it wasn't pre-recorded, I'd tell him. I'd tell him that you were relating that story. So Cliff Richard, 8 o'clock next Thursday on LBC. It's my final show before Christmas. What a way to go out, Gyles.
I mean,
Gyles
honestly,
Brandreth and Cliff Richard. It doesn't get better than that.
Well, absolutely. It is the ultimate cliffhanger from Iain Dale. 4 nights a week on LBC.
And Gyles's book is called Elizabeth, An Intimate Portrait. It's right up in the bestseller charts. Get it to number 1 for Christmas. That is the objective. Gyles, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we're going to take more of your calls on the Anne Secula's verdict, which we did talk about in the 7 o'clock hour, but we're going to do it a lot more because there's so much to say. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the American woman who admitted causing the death of teenager Harry Dunn has been given an 8-month suspended prison sentence. 45